Hello friends, this is René with Enjoy Beekeeping, and today we're going to talk about feeding bees. And this is a really good topic, especially if you're a beginner, because usually you have a lot of questions in the beginning. And unlike a dog or a cat, which you would normally feed every day, bees are wild animals, and they pretty much forage on their own, but there are times when you have to help them out a little bit. So today we're going to talk about some of the things that I've found to be helpful, and depending on where you live, of course, your climate, the conditions where you are is going to have a factor in what you do. But today we're going to cover some things that should give you a pretty good outline of what you could do to keep an eye on your bees. So we're going to talk about, number one, why feed your bees? And that does depend on what your beekeeping goals are. But just real quick, there's two things to keep in mind. The two rules, I guess, is always feed a package of bees. So if you just bought a 2 or 3 pound package of bees and you've installed them into a hive, they pretty much only have the stripes on their backs. That's it. They don't have anything built up. They have no food stores. So it's real important to feed a package. Now, you may not have to feed them for long, especially if you're in a honey flow, but it's a good practice to always feed a package. I always call it a housewarming gift. So whenever I install a package of bees, I always joke around and I tell people I'm going to give them the housewarming gift, fill up the feeder. A day of moving is always a nice reward to have something to eat at the end of the day. So another thing, a good rule to follow is feed to avoid starvation. So if you only live by 2 rules, these would be good. And depending on your goals, again, we're going to cover some of that in just a minute here. But let's look at some of the pros and cons when it comes to feeding bees. The pros are it will quickly establish a package or even a nuke. So if you just purchased a nuke, they probably have a little bit of honey with them. So again, depending on the time of year, there may or may not be a honey flow out there, and you'll want to kind of give them a little boost. You could, okay? It just depends on your management style. I'm going to tell you a little bit about mine in a minute. Another benefit of feeding is in the early spring, there's a lot of beekeepers that will feed them even before a flow, kind of give them a head start. You can kind of build up the brood a little bit earlier than usual and then kind of get them ready with a large number of bees before the honey flow. Another benefit is you can extend the brood rearing season. And of course, we covered this, preventing starving during the dearth, which is just a period of time that we have here where we live in Georgia in midsummer. It's just a hot, dry time of the year. Well, maybe sometimes it's not always dry, but it's very hot, and all the spring blooms have gone away. So it's just hot and green, but there's not really a lot for the bees to forage. So that's called a dearth. And of course, during winter, they really can't forage very much in winter. Now, in Georgia, where we live, we have a mild winter. It can get as cold as maybe 18 degrees. Maybe once in a while we'll see, like 0 or something, but it's very, very rare, and it only lasts for a very short time. So you have to kind of gauge what kind of winter you have wherever you live. But bees are pretty good at riding out winters in most climates. Another benefit to feeding is it's great for making splits for a longer season than just the honey flow. So you kind of have to look and see or ask yourself, well, what are my beekeeping goals? So let's just say, for example, you wanted to have a really good honey season. You may want to feed early in the spring before the flow begins to build up your workforce. Okay, does that make sense? Another thing, I see some beekeepers do this. I'm a beekeeper that sells bees. I really don't sell honey. And one of the techniques I see guys that sell bees do is they feed them almost the entire year, minus winter. Of course, they don't feed them during winter. But the minute the temps are above 60 degrees, they're feeding them all year long, I should say, whether it's a honey flow, whether we're in a dearth, whether we're in the fall. They feed them and feed them and feed them, and it stimulates them to keep on raising brood, and they just split them and split them and split them. I don't really think that's a good idea. I kind of think that kind of goes against their natural instincts based on the season, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But I just want to give you a couple examples of, why you might want to feed. Now, here's the cons. It can make your bees a little bit lazy. They naturally forage, but if they've got a constant, steady supply of sugar, sitting right above their heads, they're not going to really get out there very much. So that will happen. So keep that in mind. If you do feed a lot, it can have that effect. This, to me, this number 2, it clogs the brood nest. I find that to be probably one of the biggest cons, because the queen wants to lay eggs, but the worker bees want to store nectar or sugar water. That's what they'll put in there. And it makes it very difficult for the colony to really establish an equilibrium. So they'll clog up the brood nest, which then will stimulate swarming. And if it's in the spring, that's okay, I guess. If they cast a swarm during the spring, there's resources out there. They can go get them and set up a new colony. But if you accidentally stimulate them too much, like let's say it's fall, getting ready to go into winter, but you still got maybe a couple weeks of warm weather, and if you overfeed, you could actually trigger a swarm which would die because there's not enough resources that are going to last long enough. So you got to be careful of that. Finally, too, when it comes to sugar or even pollen, it's really not the perfect food for bees. We all know that bees eat honey. They take nectar, they make honey out of it. They go out and harvest pollen, then they make bee bread with it. So the best thing for bees is to not feed them if at all possible. And that brings me to my style of beekeeping. I'm kind of big into natural management. I always put the picture of a chicken in my presentations when I talk about natural bee management, because I live in what's called the chicken capital of the world. I'm not too far from Gainesville, Georgia, and I remember riding through Gainesville wondering where all the chickens were, and I never saw any. And it's because they were always in these, I call them chicken concentration camps. So I always ask myself, if I wanted to learn how to raise chickens, would I go and ask this guy in the picture with the hazmat outfit on, or would I go to maybe one of the farmers that have free-range chickens? That seems to be the most logical way to learn, is to learn from someone that's raising them in a way that's natural, because chickens like to be outside and so on and so forth. So I don't want to make this into a chicken lecture, but again, I like to encourage my bees to forage naturally. And you can see that bee in the picture has a little bit of pollen on their saddlebags. I call them saddlebags on their legs. Okay, so we talked about some of the pros and cons. Now let's talk about when might be a good time to feed your bees. In my basic 101 course, I talk about the 4 seasons of beekeeping. And in January through March, where I live, it's pretty dormant. But right around mid to late February, things start picking up. The bees start getting ready for swarm season. During that time, you can just pretty much let the bees forage the entire season, and if you have a good season, you don't even need to worry about feeding them. I just kind of check on them. And then that honey flow starts to shut off right around the early part of June. Now, depending on where you live, this graph might look a little different. I used to live up in New York, and for us, this peak where the surfer guy is riding the top of the wave here, that peak would be around July, late June to July. So you can probably figure out, based on your climate, where the most forage for the bees comes in at, what time of year. And then in the fall, we have just a little bit of a fall flow. And I've got a lot of colonies in my bee yard, and I raise up a lot of them in 5-frame and 8-frame equipment. So right now, it's August 2016. I have about 50 colonies in the yard right now. And in August, the bees will, if you're ever wondering, okay, so it's summertime, should I feed them or shouldn't I feed them? Here's a picture of bees eating dry sugar out of a barrel. And I just went out one day, I had this barrel covered. It was sitting upright, it was covered, I had a tarp on it, I had the lid on it, but I saw a tornado of bees just swarming around it, and they had apparently found a crack between the cover and the side of the barrel, and they were getting in it. So I just decided, well, they want it, so I'm going to just dump it on its side and let them have it. Now, if there's a honey flow on, the bees would not want dry sugar. That's just like you saying, I want to eat dry toast all day. You'll eat it, but you may not really like it, but you do it to survive. And that's kind of what you see here going on in the picture. The bees are doing this just because there's not much out there to choose from. So they kind of attack this barrel, and they're still working on it. And I just kind of leave it out there for them. So if you have anything with honey or sugar on it and the bees are ignoring it, that means there's a flow. They're happy with what they're finding. You don't have to worry about feeding them. But during a dearth, if there's a drop of honey, they'll clean it up fast. Or if there's any sugar left out, they'll clean it up fast. So if you're not real good and you're into kind of, you're a beginner beekeeper and you want to test that out, that's how you can test it. Just put a little bit of a tablespoon of honey out somewhere. If you're in a dearth, they're going to find it quick. So let's see. Oh, here, and I've got them, you can see them flying around in here. I'm just going to let you watch, and they're enjoying that sugar. But usually what I find is in the morning, there's dew that kind of condensates on the side of the barrel. And the sides of the barrel get wet, and so they're really going after the moist sugar that they can find. I don't spray it or anything. Once in a while, I guess I do spray just a little bit of water in there. It does make it easier. But what they'll do is they'll go out and get a little bit of water and kind of spit on it, and then they'll lick it up. So that's what the bees are doing here, is they're just kind of moistening the sugar so that they can lick it up, because they really can't carry it back. And there's even some, I think those are yellow jackets or hornets. A few of them show up. I guess they like the sugar too. But they get into it. The honeybees are the ones that are getting the lion's share of all that you see here. So they work around the sides pretty good. That's where that morning moisture seems to pick up the most, and so they kind of cluster around the sides. And they just work it and work it and work it. And I always say that, if you're in a dearth, putting out some dry sugar like this will just kind of improve morale. Okay? Now here's my, this is a bird bath, but no birds ever come here because of what you see happening in the picture here. This is my bee watering hole. They pretty much have been trained to come here. But over in the left, you see here, I've got some Himalayan salt. And I'm going to talk about that, why that's important, because that's one of the first things I actually recommend beekeepers feed their bees. So you see them, the salt gets in the water, that keeps mosquitoes out of it, which is a plus. But then the bees will lick up the water around the salt, and we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about what to feed. Top of my list, salt. This is called Himalayan pink salt. Now, technically speaking, all salt is sea salt. It doesn't matter where you get it, because they can call it sea salt. That means if you go to McDonald's and the salt they put on the fries, technically that is sea salt. But I want to just share with you a little bit about this particular kind of salt. If you haven't heard about it, I've just recently learned about the benefits of this type of salt. This particular salt has 84 natural minerals in it. The benefits kind of go on to include improving and regulating cell function, promoting stable pH. The minerals in the salt, now I didn't know this, there's 84. in this particular salt. Most of the salt that we get in the restaurants, or even our table salt, doesn't have that. And this is good for people and for bees. Now I'm going to give you a link to the website where I found out some of the benefits of this salt, but let me just share with you a few things that I think you might find interesting. Let me just get down here. Okay, let's talk about table salt for a minute, because some people might ask, well, can I just use the salt I got in my salt shaker? Well, here's what it says. It says many people are unaware that common table salt contains chemicals and even sugar. So it's true that salt is necessary but can be dangerous if taken in this chemical form. Table salt is composed of 97.5% sodium chloride and 2.5% of chemicals like iodine. You know, we often see salt and it says good for iodine supplement. All right, here's the problem though with that salt. Common salt is dried at more than 12,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Now when they do that, it zaps many of the natural chemical structures in the salt. So table and cooking salt, which is usually found in most people's homes, restaurants, and processed foods, is void of nutritional value, and it lacks those 84 beneficial trace minerals. Now when you process that salt, it turns into sodium chloride. Now that's an unnatural salt that the human body actually sees as a toxic invader. So your body can't dispose of it in a natural way, which can lead to irritation of your tissues, water retention, and high blood pressure. So if you've been trying to watch your blood pressure, this salt will actually improve your health versus regular table salt. Now this is good for animals. So a lot of people that own livestock like horses and cows, a lot of times they'll put a salt lick out, and so that's my version of it for the bees. So the bees will take it, and they love it, and they only need just a little bit. In fact, that container will probably last you a good long time. So make sure you include salt in some way for your bees. Next is pollen. Now in Georgia, where I live, we have an abundance of pollen. In fact, when spring rolls around, we have actually yellow clouds of pollen every time the wind blows, because we have a lot of Georgia pine. And so the bees can practically fly through the air and get all the pollen they need on their legs and then just come back in the hive. We've got pollen like you wouldn't believe. So I've not had to supplement pollen with my bees. However, based on some recommendations from other natural beekeepers, Ultra Bee is a good pollen substitute. So if you feel that your bees are not gathering enough pollen, or if you feel that they might be short, and the way you can test this, here's a good way to test it. Just like putting that sugar out in the Dearth will tell you if they're wanting sugar or not. If they ignore it, then they don't need it. Same thing with the pollen substitute. You can throw a couple scoops into an empty bucket or barrel and just lay it on its side. And if the bees take it, that means they're looking for some pollen. But the minute they have pollen, they're going to ignore what you've got sitting in the bucket for them. Okay? So when it comes to pollen, this is one that was recommended to me by one of my beekeeping mentors, and I'm just passing it along to you. I don't sell this product, and I've not used it personally, but this is one that someone that I trust does use. So if you're thinking about looking at that as an option, maybe this is a good starting point. Sugar seems to be the most used supplement for feeding bees. And I use just a granulated plain white sugar. You can buy it in the 5-pound bag, the Domino sugar. If you've got the money, raw organic sugar is really good. But let's talk about how to feed our bees, because sugar is the most used item for feeding. So let's talk about how. We already talked about how we can feed pollen and maybe some dry sugar, but most of the time you're going to be making a liquid sugar. So here's a few mixing ratios for you. If it's warm out, and it's going to stay warm for a while, 1-to-1, so a cup of sugar to a cup of water will get you a 1-to-1 ratio, or you could take a gallon of sugar to a gallon of water. That'll give you the 1-to-1 ratio. On cold weather, or I should say cool weather, so if it's not freezing out, and that's important to differentiate it, if it's not freezing, it's cool. So a real thick 3 cups of sugar, maybe even 4 to 1 cup of water. You want it to be a consistency of like peach syrup. And in cold weather, you can only feed dry. I don't recommend feeding anything liquid during cold weather. But our goal is to feed the bees before that winter hits, where we have to administer maybe some dry sugar. But here's a video that I did of mixing the 1-to-1 sugar water. One of the easiest ways to feed bees is by using a canning jar and just putting a feeder jar upside down on the top of the beehive. So what I want to do is just show you how I mix a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar water to feed the bees. Keep in mind that sugar, because of its nature, has a lot of air space between it. So I've got a little bucket of just plain old white granulated sugar, and what I'm going to do is fill this jar. Remember, this is a quart jar. I'm going to fill it about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way with sugar. See, even though the jar looks like it's half full right now, if we could squeeze the volume of that sugar down, it would only be about 1/4 of the jar full. So we have to keep adding more sugar to allow for the air space. So we can fill this up probably right about there. That's about 2/3 to 3/4 full, but because of the air space, it's really only about half a jar of sugar. So we're going to fill the rest of it with water. You can see the air bubbles coming up out of the sugar. Now if you look, you can see now that water is coming down into the sugar, and now it looks like there's about a half a jar of sugar. So that's how I get my 1-to-1 ratio. All I got to do now is stir it or shake it up. In this case, I'm going to stir it because the jar lid that I have has the pinholes in it, and if I shake it up, I'll be wearing sticky sugar water. I don't want that. So we'll stir it up, and we'll add a little bit of Nectar Gold to it. So here's my high-tech stirrer. I just use a twig, whichever's closest to where I'm pouring the water, and we'll stir this up real good. You do want the sugar to dissolve as much as you can, so if you can use warm water, that'll help. You don't really need to boil the water. In fact, it's probably better if you don't. I'll use hot water, but just hot enough where I can put my hand under it without burning. But to be honest with you, on a day like today, it's a pretty warm summer day. The water out of the tap, if I stir it for a minute or two, it'll pretty much dissolve all the way. So I just like to use a little bit of Nectar Gold. I'll shake it up a little bit before I use it. And the way this ratio is, it's 1 ounce of Nectar Gold for every gallon of water. Well, since I only have a quart, the best way to do this is just to measure out a capful and add that to a quart of water. So there's my capful. It's in. And I can stir that a little bit too. And now you're ready to feed. In fact, before I go, I'm going to add just a little bit more water. I can add, I'm going to get as close to the top as I can. That'll last longer for the bees. Every little bit helps when you've got a bunch of colonies and you don't want to feed them all the time. So we're going to add a little bit more water. I like to use the one-piece steel jar lid. I just take a finishing nail and I tap about 20 holes into the jar lid. You don't want them real big, but as soon as you break through, you're done. You don't have to drive the whole nail through. Just get a little hole in there, and you can put up to about 20 of them like I got here. And the one-piece jar works better than the two-piece jar canning lids. So I just put that on real tight. And then once I turn it upside down, it won't gush out. It'll just be a little bit of sugar there for the bees to drink. And during the dearth that we're in now, this jar will be gone in a day. That's how quickly they'll take this. Okay, I'm back here. That was the recorded segment. I'm going to talk a little bit about Nectar Gold with you. But one thing, too, that you want to do as a beekeeping management strategy is to build your colonies heavy before winter. So you want them to become strong, and you want them to not have to, you don't want to have to get in there in the wintertime. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to get to is if you can help them to build up their stores in the fall, okay, that's going to really help you ride out the winter. Now, sometimes you do have to intervene, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But in my climate, okay, now remember, every time we talk about feeding, you have to kind of adjust to where it is you live, okay? What kind of winter do you get? We only get about 3 months of winter, and it's pretty mild. Maybe you get 6 months of winter, and it's very cold, okay? But as a rule, where I live, one of those, see the 3 boxes that you see stacked up here, 1 box of honey will get a colony this size through the winter where I live. So what I'll do is turning maybe around September and October, if I don't see a lot of honey stores, at least a box full, I'll feed them until they've packed that sugar water into the cells. It'll look like honey when they get done packing it. But the advantage of doing that is when your bees cluster, they're clustering right around their food source. Okay? So anytime you have to break up the cluster during winter, that's when you can accidentally kill a colony. So, you may have to get in there in the wintertime, but I try to avoid doing that if at all possible. And for a good management technique to follow, try to build them up heavy before winter sets in. So, start planning this about a month to a month and a half ahead. Okay? Now, let's say you do get into the wintertime, or let's say it's just getting too cold. Maybe maybe where you live, you got an early a winter season coming in on you, and you're getting some below freezing temperatures already. So the next best thing is to feed dry sugar. There's a couple ways you can do it. You can just put an empty super above the brood nest and lay a couple sheets of newspaper down and just dump out a couple bags of sugar. That's all you have to do. I know there's candy boards. There's solid, sugar that you can use. This is really all you have to do. And what's funny about this is the reason why you see this is like, wow, that sounds lazy. Well, when you have a lot of bees, this works. And that's why beekeepers do it. It works. It does the trick. Now, what's really good about this is they won't starve, okay? And pretty much the only time they're really going to go after this is when it's warm enough where they can kind of break the cluster a little bit, and they'll go up there and they'll start nibbling on that sugar. And you can encourage that just by taking a very, very light mist, spray some water, a little bit of mist of water on top of that sugar, just a few squirts here and there. It'll get the bees interested in it. They'll start taking it, and they'll figure it out that, hey, we've got food to get through the winter. So winter feeding is dry, okay? And it's that simple. Now, you can put it on top of a newspaper, or let's just say you've got maybe a 10-frame hive, and that's your brood area, okay? So you want to dump that sugar. You can actually take out a frame or two out of your brood nest off to one side, and you can just pour that right into the brood nest. It sounds messy, and it is at first, but the bees will clean it up. So you can do it one of two ways. You can just put it right on top of the newspaper, or take out a couple of frames and just dump it right in there. But just make sure that they've got enough weight. This looks like about 2 bags of sugar. Okay, so depending on where you live, load them up. And if you get a warm day, maybe warm in your area be like 50 degrees. Here in Georgia, we sometimes get 65 or 70 degree days. That's usually a good reason to go out and check. Try to be quick about it. Mainly what you're looking for is just to see if they've got food and if they're still alive. And then I just close it back up. All right, I talk a little bit about a product called Nectar Gold. Nectar Gold is kind of an interesting story. There's a couple of guys that live near me. They're about an hour away. And one of them is a microbiologist. You know, that's the cool thing about beekeeping is you will always meet interesting people. His name is Boris, and he has a brother named Michael. And both of them are organic beekeepers. In fact, Boris, he's a naturopath. So they got to talking one day, the two brothers, and they were talking about bees, and they were talking about feeding them. And they both came to the agreement that when you just feed plain old white sugar, it keeps them alive, but it really doesn't contain anything nutritional for them. I mean, it's kind of like, eating dry toast. You can live on it, but, you're not really going to thrive on it. So they came up with a product, and they were just kind of keeping it as a family thing. But then they decided to market it, and it really didn't take off because they had a fellow that was helping them market, and I guess he got a better job offer, and he took that. So it just kind of sat for a while because, like I say, Boris is got his naturopath business. But I called him the one day, and I said, Boris, do you got any more of that Nectar Gold? I really like using it. And he says, oh, I got a little I could probably, put together for you. But in a nutshell, he says, would you like to help me promote this a little bit? And I said, okay, sure, why not? So you can buy Nectar Gold on my website, but here's what I like about it. Boris and Michael are organic beekeepers. They kind of do things the way I do. That's what I like about using this product. It's a plant extract concentrate. It gives the bees very good nutritional support, and it mimics flower nectar. And you only need to use 1 ounce per gallon of liquid sugar water that you mix. Now, there's a couple of really cool things that came about through a study that they did on what Nectar Gold was doing for the bees. The two things that stood out was it increased the bees' lifespan. Now, worker bees, they only live about 6 to 8 weeks, and the lifespan was increased by about 20%. So that's pretty good. The other thing is it does stimulate brood production, which is pretty much going to happen no matter what kind of stimulant that you use, but this is more than just a stimulant. The other thing that they found was very unexpected is that bees were producing wax at later stages in life. Usually it's just the nurse bees in the first couple of weeks. They're the ones that produce the wax. Well, they found that when they were using Nectar Gold, because the chemical composition is so close to real flowers, that they were actually healthier bees, and because they were getting the nutritional support they needed. So this is a product I'm very familiar with. I've used it for a long time. It hasn't really gotten out there with very much exposure. But because of all the beehives that I have, I only use this on the ones that are kind of, I don't know, they look kind of sickly, They're not really too many bees. They're not building up too good. And I'm trying to decide, should I keep them? Should I just let them go? I give them the Nectar Gold, and wouldn't you know it, almost every single time I do that, it's like they go on steroids. So I just wanted to put that out there for you. Do me a favor. If you want to order it, please order it from my website, enjoybeekeeping.com. If you do a Google search on Nectar Gold, you're going to find the original site, which is, it's semi-functional, okay? But I don't want anyone to go there and accidentally place an order. Order it from enjoybeekeeping.com. We're in the stages of getting that all straightened around. This is a really good product. I do recommend. I'm very pleased with the results that I've gotten from it, and I think this would be a good supplement to put in your arsenal for caring for your bees. And then finally, friends, if you would like to learn more, I love talking about bees with people that want to get started. And the reason why I did this is because when I first started out, I was, making my share of mistakes, and I had some pretty good teachers. But about half of all new beekeepers lose their bees during their first year. I was one of them. And that's frustrating because if you haven't already figured it out, beekeeping can be fairly expensive. So not to mention the cost of bees, and then you get a beehive, and it's kind of like remodeling a kitchen when you buy bees. You can spend $500 $5,000 or you can spend $50,000 when it comes to raising bees. You can get all kinds of fancy equipment. So what I have done is I've made a Beekeeping 101 for beginners. It's an online class, just like what we're doing now. And we can cover the basics of beekeeping. It'll give you a real good working knowledge of what you really need as far as being a beekeeper. The good news is it doesn't have to be a real expensive hobby. There's going to be, a little bit of upfront investment, but there's a lot of things that you can do if you're handy. You can put together your own bee boxes, feeding them. It doesn't have to be an ongoing process. If you're like me, I only feed it if absolutely necessary. And then I'll boost them a little bit. And especially before winter, that's really when I focus in on that. So in this Beekeeping 101 for beginners, I usually send out an email just to let folks know that, hey, I'm going to do a class. I do charge for it. So just so you know, it does take a little bit of work. Well, in fact, it's probably a project and a half when I actually do one of these things. So I do charge for it. But I do think that for the cost of the class, it's well worth it. Because in addition to the class, I kind of keep in touch with my students. So if you got a question, you can call me, you can email me, and I'll be happy to walk you through some stuff. And sometimes I even learn things from my students, and I kind of incorporate those into the class. But I want to help you learn how to beat the odds. So if you'd like to learn more and become a successful beekeeper instead of this guy here in the picture, give me a shout or keep your eyes open for one of my emails, and we'll let you know when the next class is. So friends, that's it for our program. I really appreciate everyone attending, and we'll see you next time.